looks like it's all good, and you can hear me? Good. Okay, so hi, my name is Jan Gorzny. I'm from QuantStamp. I'm here presenting EVM to EVM chain bridges, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I apologize if you came here for the other talk, which is water under the bridge regarding hacks about these bridges. That talk will be given, but it will be given on Saturday by my colleague Martin instead of myself. We switched this in part because of just the logistics, but also because this is a better introduction to the topic. So if you don't know what we're talking about for that talk, this one might help you a little bit. So this presentation was created by colleagues at QuantStamp, Alex and Mainnet, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, so I'm presenting on their behalf. So in this talk, we're going to give a very rough design overview of three chains that bridge assets primarily to Polygon. I mean, these bridges may chain other assets to other chains, but we're going to be using, as an example, transferring DAI to the Polygon network and just exploring how these systems work. Because not all bridges are created equally, and maybe people don't know that. We certainly didn't, or at least I didn't, and so we're just going to talk about how they work. We're going to detail some specific asset bridging mechanisms, and we're going to talk about the fee structures a little bit of these bridges. We'll also highlight some notable UX features and some other technical things that these bridges implement. So, as I've already mentioned, we are going to be talking about taking DAI from the Ethereum mainnet onto the Polygon mainnet, and we're going to have a couple options for this. The first option is to use the Polygon native bridge. Right, this is the bridge that Polygon themselves implemented to get assets from the Ethereum mainnet onto the Polygon network. But since Polygon's open source and there's a lot of other decentralization going on, naturally other people have also tried to solve this problem. So we're also going to look at two other example bridges, Multichain and Hop Exchange. We didn't pick these for any particular reason other than we came across them. We thought they were interesting and they were open source, so we could take a look at them. So let's start with the Polygon native bridge. This is the one that was implemented and developed by Polygon. So unsurprisingly, it's run by Polygon validators. The source is available online, and there's a URL there if you do want to go check it out. What this bridge does is it takes real DAI on the Ethereum mainnet. It has some specific contract that you know and love for DAI, and then it maps it to a so-called POS DAI on the Polygon main chain. So those contract addresses are not necessarily the same, as we see here on the bottom, but the idea is to maintain a mapping between DAI on Polygon and DAI on Ethereum in a one-to-one sort of mapping. This requires some sort of a state sync mechanism to keep these numbers always in check, because obviously you don't want them to be askew. So we're going to look at that state sync mechanism, and just as a note, it does take about 5 to 10 minutes to bridge assets from one chain to the other. If there's a large amount of DAI being transferred, it might take up to 24 hours. So the first use case is, well, we have DAI on Ethereum. We want to see what happens if we can put it onto the Polygon chain. So what we do is we call a function through the UI, and essentially we say we want to put 15 DAI from Ethereum onto Polygon. A transaction that occurs on Etherscan is something that looks like this. The details are not particularly involved. It looks like we've transferred 15 DAI, as you can see there. And then on the other end, what happens is that a state sync transaction occurs on the Polygon chain. So this is a bit odd, because what is a state sync transaction? This is not something that's particularly common on Ethereum. In fact, it's not something that's native to Ethereum. And instead, it's a type of transaction that the Polygon validators sort of put onto the Polygon chain. This is a modification that they perform to the Polygon consensus. So they create this thing, effectively creating DAI on the Polygon chain. And they did this because we locked DAI on the Ethereum contract for this bridge. And so we lock it on Ethereum, and then we get some new stuff on Polygon. And if we want to go the opposite direction, we'll have to do the sort of reverse of that. But let's take a quick look at the technical end of this, because while the first transaction was sort of straightforward, we just sent 15 DAI somewhere, which is what you'd expect, this transaction is a little bit more involved. In particular, we see that this transaction is to and from the 0 address, which is a bit odd, because normally you can't really get transactions coming out of the 0 address in Ethereum, and yet here it's happening, and this is because of that modification to the consensus sovereign that Polygon has done in order to run their network. Moreover, we submitted a request for 15 DAI, and so if we looked at this transaction, which has our address on it, on the bottom, we also notice some other stuff has happened. There's something called HETH that's present. That seems a bit odd at first glance. Am I getting free stuff? That would be great. But no, that's actually not the case. And we'll actually talk about what happens there a little bit later in the talk. But it's ultimately an artifact of the technical features that this bridge in particular supports. And we will, like I said, we will talk about what that is exactly. But for now, we did do some stuff. Somehow 15 DAI has been created on Polygon, so we're pretty happy. We're almost done with our transaction. And if we take a look at exactly what happened, well, in the UI on the Ethereum end, we called a deposit for through some UI. We sent the right address of the token that we wanted to create on the Polygon chain. So we called deposit for, passing in the parameter of the DAI contract on the Ethereum mainnet, along with the value that we wanted to transfer, i.e. 15. And then we locked some tokens as part of that transaction. There was a method called to lock tokens somewhere in there. And then what it did was the contract that handles the Ethereum, the Polygon Bridge, did something that says, let's emit this thing called a state sync event. And so that's what this sort of sync state thing is. And so they emit this event on Ethereum, and then the Polygon validators watch for and process this event as part of their job. And when they see one of these events, they can then interact with the Polygon chain. In particular, they will say, okay, we saw a state sync on Ethereum for 15 DAI. Let's now invoke deposit from the DAI contract on the Polygon network and give this person, that is my address, the corresponding amount of DAI on Polygon. So pretty straightforward. It uses events to track. If we want to do the opposite, let's say I'm bored with Polygon, it was a great experience, but I want to take it off. What do I got to do? Well, in this case, it's not quite the same. This time what we do is we call a withdraw function on the UI for Polygon, and then we have to wait for something called a checkpoint. And a checkpoint is essentially just a time delay so that the Polygon verifiers or validators can make sure that in some suitable time frame after this function is called, this function or these coins are not spent anywhere else. Essentially just making sure that in sort of the near future, I'm not double spending this DAI, and that people sort of acknowledge that I am in fact withdrawing this. On the Ethereum end of it, eventually we are able to call an exit function from the contract corresponding to the Polygon Bridge on Ethereum, and in particular, I have to pay for the gas fees for that. So if I want to withdraw my DAI that I've now sort of sent back to the Ethereum main chain, well, I got to make an Ethereum main chain call. Naturally, that costs gas. Right? Why that's important is because we'll see some other chains that don't, or some other bridges that don't necessarily do that. So in particular, the steps for taking our DAI out of Polygon and back onto Ethereum, so we call some withdraw function. We waited for some checkpoint. This checkpoint allowed some time to pass, some validators to compute some block hashes to make a Merkle proof that sort of says, yeah, we actually did do this burn on the Polygon network. And then eventually we can call exit on the Ethereum mainnet, accept this proof of burn that the validators have created, verify that we in fact did that, and then get our tokens back. There's also some other notable features of this chain that we didn't really talk about yet. We have alluded to some of them. The first one is Polygon minted tokens. So typically, what sort of traditionally has happened in the Ethereum ecospace is, I've got a new token, I want to do something with it. I want to create an ERC20 token to sort of handle it. I'm going to deploy first on Ethereum. Makes a lot of sense. Polygon actually lets you sort of do the opposite, where you say, okay, I'm going to deploy first on a layer 2 solution, in particular Polygon. And you can sort of treat the Polygon network as sort of the original source of truth for this token, which is kind of neat. For details, there's a link there you can click on. There's also this other thing called the FX portal. And this is actually related to that HETH that we talked about, and we'll see it a little bit more later as we talk about another exchange, or sorry, another bridge. But this sort of allows a cross-chain tunneling mechanism for other bridges, and Hop Exchange actually does take advantage of this. So in summary, well, how does this bridge work? Well, it's mostly baked into the validators. Not surprising, Polygon built this thing. They have validators, might as well put them to use. It maintains a token mapping between assets on either chain, and finality depends on other events in the Ethereum context or checkpoints in the Polygon context. In terms of the user experience, to send stuff, I only had to make one transaction. I had to send tokens. Obviously, there was an approval that probably need to be made, but ignoring the approval, it was just one transaction. On the other hand, taking it out was 2 transactions. I had to make a call on the Polygon chain and the Ethereum chain. Some notable features, as we already discussed, the FX portal, which we'll go into detail about, and some Polygon minted assets being a possibility. So let's take a look at another one. just to compare, because the idea is to compare them and see how they're different. So this one, the next one we're going to take a look at for no particular reason is Multichain, formerly known as Anyswap. So Multichain supports a bunch of chains, not just Polygon and Ethereum. It supports 25 different chains of various kinds. The code is open sourced, so we were able to take a look. We're constant, but so we are familiar with taking a look at code, but this was not a security review. We're just looking at the code to see how it works and seeing what's interesting about it. To compare the time, it takes about 10 to 30 minutes to send DAI from Ethereum to Polygon. And again, if you're sending large amounts, it might take you up to a day. This is just to make sure that things work the way it should. If we want to make a deposit, what we're going to do is we're going to make some sort of a call that allows us to send DAI to something on the Ethereum main chain, which is fine. We're going to send 15 again in this example. On the other end, we're going to receive something. So if we take a look, we have actually sent DAI, and on some contract somewhere, we instead got 15 any DAI, which is not the same as real DAI. It's supposed to be pegged one-to-one in some sense, and the idea is that we're going to use any DAI, or any token more generally, as an intermediary for these tokens. And so I will send DAI, get any DAI, and then the other end, I will convert any DAI into DAI if there's sort of a market for that. So this is the other end. On the Polygon side, we take our any DAI and we want to put that into POS DAI, which is the real DAI on Polygon. And so what we did was we call swap out any underlying, and so we took some DAI on the Ethereum mainnet, we burned it, we created some any DAI, and then we bridged the any DAI, and then on the Polygon side, we'll take the any DAI, we'll burn that, and we'll receive real POS DAI. The multi-chain nodes do this. They burn, or they create the transaction on the Polygon side. And if on the other end, on Polygon, we get any DAI, but there's not enough POS DAI because everyone's holding onto the POS DAI, then we're sort of stuck with any DAI, which is not necessarily a problem because I can either swap that for any DAI later when that becomes an option, i.e. when someone's willing to sell their any DAI for this, or sorry, their POS DAI for this any DAI, or I could just bridge it back to the Ethereum mainnet and take back my DAI as I want. Going the other direction, taking my coins now off of Polygon and putting it back onto Ethereum. The nice part about this bridge is it's totally symmetric. Now I'm saying, well, I have any DAI, I want to get my DAI back on the other chain, and so these any DAI sort of intermediaries allow the process to be totally symmetric as long as there is this ability to swap any DAI to real DAI or any token in general to whatever the real token is. And this does use an AMM for this. The good news is too, this is also very effective for other chains that do similar things like BSC. So in summary, it has a more universal sort of token transfer system. It uses these any tokens as an intermediary, and the finality is all based on events being emitted on the appropriate chain. For the UX, it's a little bit more streamlined. There's one transaction in either direction, and the relayer charges some fees along the way. I don't know if you were paying close enough attention. I didn't highlight it. We actually got 14.1 instead of 15 DAI on that chain. We can also do Polygon minted assets with this bridge, which is kind of nice. And it doesn't quite yet support cross-chain contract calls for the general case. So the last one we want to take a look at in the last 5 minutes is Hop Exchange. So Hop Exchange typically operates between Ethereum and various layer 2 rollups, in particular like Polygon, Gnosis, Arbitrum, or Optimism. The code, once again, open source, so we're able to take a look and see how this functions under the hood at a very quick glance. And it does have some similar aspects to multi-chain, but it's a little bit more tailored toward layer 2s rather than arbitrary layer 1s. So if we want to take our DAI, once again, from Ethereum. We've got lots of DAI on Ethereum. We want to put it onto Polygon. We're going to try this experiment one last time to see what the differences are. We're going to make this function call to send to L2, which may have been done through UI. And here we're actually going to send 40 DAI instead of 15. And the reasons for this will become a little bit clearer a little bit later. What happens? Well, Hop Exchange uses that FX portal that allows other bridges to sort of use the same state sync transactions that we talked about earlier for the Polygon native bridge. And so we actually have Hop Exchange creating something called an HDAI. So this is something similar to the any DAI that we saw for the multi-swap, but it's now sort of H token for whatever the token is. And so this is also what that H ETH was. So these state sync events are sort of summarizing and aggregating a bunch of transactions. And so when we saw H ETH earlier, it's not that we were getting it just because the validator said, well, a whole bunch of people were transferring a whole bunch of assets, let's do it all at once. And the ones that happen to come with an H sort of as a prefix come through the hop exchange protocol. And so here we do see we have our 40 ETH being transferred, but there are also some other things going on in the state sync, which is again from 0 to 0. Okay, so what did we do? We called send to L2. It swapped some DAI into some H DAI using an AVM, and then we're going to actually make the call on Polygon's cross-chain contract. So not Hop Exchange's contract. We're going to do it through Polygon. Now, it might be Hop Exchange calling Polygon, but ultimately we're using the Polygon Bridge contract in some way. In particular, we're creating this of this FX base route tunnel thing, whatever that is. Obviously, there's a lot more details we could talk about, but I've only got 20 minutes. And then eventually that contract makes a call that says, okay, let me swap out H DAI on the Polygon chain to POS DAI, which is sort of the real DAI on Polygon, and we're all really happy that we got our DAI in the end. So almost the same, but a little bit different. So we've seen now 3 different ways of doing this. We're not done though anyways. Let's try to get our money back. And this is one of the bigger differences in the Hop Exchange protocol. We want to take our 40 ETH back. Remember, we sent 40, not 15 this time. We try to do this, and it looks like we're going to get about 3.6 ETH. Or sorry, 3.6 DAI. That's a bit odd. We wanted 40. So what's happening here? Well, here the UX is changing a little bit. Instead of me having to call an exit call on the Ethereum contract for this bridge and pay gas fees, the Hop Exchange will send me my DAI right away. And so what I'm doing is essentially paying for this gas fee up front and having someone else make that call for me. And this is why I'm losing a whole bunch of my money in this transaction. At this point, it's about 91% of my funds lost, but that's only because I'm making a very small transfer. The amount you transfer doesn't really change the gas cost. And so if you only send a couple, you're going to lose a lot of that to gas because it's a lot of things. If you send a lot, it's not so bad. Okay, so you can see we did lose 91% of it. So we already talked about this. I'm getting the signal to wrap up. So just note, use H tokens, not any tokens. The finality is mixed depending on the chain that goes on. And we only really have to do one transaction on either direction, but we pay for gas fees in different ways. Okay, so in conclusion, a lot of bridges. They all kind of do the same thing, but there's a lot of little subtle things in between them. So if you're looking to build one or build on one, you should probably understand how it works because maybe things are different. Good news is they all did work. We didn't find any issues. Obviously, it wasn't a security review, but it worked. That's good. That's what you want to see. And yeah, there's some nice mechanisms. So if you have any questions, please come find me after or come talk to me or anyone at QuantSnap about this. We're also hiring, so please come see us at booth P25 whenever that opens or on the top build floor at the Mirrors Art Gallery. Thank you.